So here's my contact information. If you do have questions or thinking something afterwards, after the session, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me. I'd prefer to take questions during the session here if we can. So just to give you some background. Oh, wait, hang on a minute. Yep, that is the right one. So some background. Planted acreage last year was down significantly, and actually that was the majority of the reduction in production. We didn't have average yields weren't quite as good as we've seen the last couple of years, but the big drop was primarily in the planted acreage. Now this shows planted acreage by state. I'll show you the production by state in just a second here. So this is total sunflower production across the United States. And again, you can see that 2024, if you go back, to 2000 recent history, very low total production. And there's a reason for that. There was a reason that we saw not only the reduction in planted acreage, but also the reduction in total acreage. Now, most of that came from the oilseed side. So if you notice, the black line on the bottom is non-oil or confection sunflower. The red line is oil type sunflowers. And then the blue, of course, is the total sunflower production. So the vast majority of the slippage in acreage, slippage in production, was due to the oilseed side of the industry. When we look at production by state, North Dakota, South Dakota being the dominant producers by pounds. And obviously the black line towards the bottom is Minnesota. So this northern tier has become kind of that dominant region. Now, all regions had reduced planted acreage as well as production, but we saw those most dramatic reduction coming in North Dakota and South Dakota. So why did that happen? I want you to focus on the blue bars on the bottom. So the red line on top is total consumption of sunflower, all types, all classes. The green line is total production. The blue bars, this comes from USDA, the blue bars are the stocks to use ratio. So we're taking our ending stocks, how much do we have at the end of the year, dividing it by our total consumption. And the reason we use that is then we can look at it across time and be more consistent. It's just a more consistent measure. And if you notice, our stocks to use ratio, the inventories of sunflower that we had within the system increased dramatically in 2023. And a big chunk of that was, obviously, we had an increase in acreage. We had some very good production within the United States, but in particular in this northern tier. And you have a really big year in a relatively small market area. And what happens is those inventories start to explode. And because of the very large inventories, the very strong production we've had over the last couple of years, we saw these inventories building. And as a result, prices started to fall. And the industry now is trying to work through this backlog of sunflowers that have been within the supply chain for a while. Now, this year, in my opinion, we took care of a lot of that. So moving forward now, the question will be what happens next? When we look at the consumption, and now this is, again, USDA information from all sunflowers, not just the confections or the oil seeds. This is all sunflowers blended together. The black line on the bottom is exports. Notice exports are usually a very small portion of our total consumption. The blue line is crushing. And again, as you can see, that crush number does vary a bit from year to year. It does vary somewhat, but we're really in about that 1 billion pounds per year in the crush sector pretty steadily. So there's this good solid foundation from the oilseed crushing sector. The red line on top is everything else. It's the non-oil use. So that would be human use. It would be birdseed use, as well as the amount that goes specifically into seed and seed production. So this non-oil use, or that human consumption, that bird food consumption, tends to be our shock absorber. If we have extra production in the supply chain, prices start to fall. It's typically that non-oil use, primarily the bird food industry, that starts pulling up and using those additional pounds. Now, in contrast, when we start really tightening or clamping down on inventories, when inventories get very tight, there does get to be more of a tug of war competition that goes on between the crush industry and the bird food industry specifically. And usually, and I'm going to be very careful about this, usually that crush margin is the one that dominates. So when we think about who can afford to pay for high-priced sunflowers, it's typically the crushing industry because that oil goes into the food industry, and human food will usually outweigh or be able to outbid what happens within the pet food industry. So I want to set this up because when we think about price and price dynamics, this is going to be really important as we move forward. So I've showed this before in some of my other presentations. I just want to explain it very quickly. This is daily price quotes from the Cargill crushing plant in West Fargo. And the reason I use that one is because they do a very good job of reporting it. It's relatively easy for me to access that information. And it also provides one constant delivery point so we can compare the sunflower price relative to canola. So when we think about the oilseed industry, and in particular, the use of the oil, because you're growing canola, you're growing sunflower primarily for the oil portion of this. Unlike soybeans, which is really a meal product, we also have the oil component to it. So the oil prices are really what drives the underlying value and more importantly, the volatility, the bouncing around of prices that we see. So if we want to compare for a consistent location, I just chose the Cargill plant in West Fargo as that reporting site. Now notice that there is a pretty strong correlation. It's not perfect, but a pretty strong relationship between what happens in the canola market, the cash market, which is the blue line, and the sunflower cash market, which is the black line. Now, these are spot market prices. They're not forward price bids. And I also added the red line, which is the canola futures price out of the Winnipeg Exchange. Now, in this graphic, I did convert from Canadian dollars per metric ton to US dollars per pound or per hundredweight so that we can have that consistent comparison. Now, so notice typically when we look over a longer period of time, sunflowers tend to be at a slight price discount to canola. And that's been going on for several years, obviously. And part of that is this buildup of inventories that we had for sunflower. Notice, however, what's happened over the last several months, especially since we've gotten into this lower production time period, when we're starting to bring those inventories down. We're now seeing a price premium for sunflowers as for farmer deliveries over canola. Now, I know people are looking at this saying, boy, I wish, that looks like some pretty high prices compared to what I might get. But again, this is delivered directly to the processing facility. So obviously some trucking differentials and some transportation costs can make up that difference. Okay, so what does that mean? And when I zoom in just a little bit, we still see this price correlation. There is this price relationship because sunflower oil and canola oil compete in the marketplace. But that relationship on a daily basis isn't quite as volatile. So rephrasing that, typically the sunflower market takes some of their guidance, some of their lead from the canola market. Now, in this case, because of the tighter supplies of sunflower relative to canola supplies are a little bit more robust this year. We're seeing that premium for sunflowers come into the market rather than a price discount. So the question a lot of people are asking is how much of a premium can sunflowers hold over canola? And in my opinion, we're starting to reach that upper boundary. At some point, sunflowers and sunflower oil is going to be priced high enough that some of those end users are going to look at it and say, well, gee, is this really worth it? Would it be more cost effective for me to reblend or remanufacture my needs and go to a heavier canola oil marketplace or canola oil consumption? So in order to get a nice significant rally, which I know a lot of farmers are looking for in today's world, for sunflowers, we're going to need to have a corresponding increase in canola. Because in my opinion, that price differential between these two oil seeds are getting broad enough, strong enough that there might be some switching going on within the end user capacity. Okay, so what now is happening very quickly in the canola market? And I do want to emphasize these major oil seeds, where they're looking at soybean oil, we're looking at sunflower oil, we're looking at canola oil. They all tend to be very highly correlated. Even though there are specific uses for these different oils, there are some kind of custom blends, if you will, but there is a lot of substitution between these. It's relatively easy for a lot of products be able to switch from one oil seed to another. And so we have to be aware of that and be cautious of that. This graphic, actually, I pulled this morning at about 9 o'clock. This overlays the price of canola futures now. This would be in Canadian dollars per metric ton, which is scaled on the right-hand side, versus U.S. soybean oil futures, not soybean futures, not Chicago Board of Trade soybeans, but actually soybean oil futures, which is scaled on the left-hand side. So soybean oil is in red, canola oil is in blue. So you can see the really tight correlations now between canola prices as a whole seed versus soybean oil prices as a crushed product here in the United States. So what happens in the soybean market, what happens globally to some of the oilseed industry globally with global trade, does spill over and have a direct impact then, or I should say a direct impact or a ripple impact, if you will, onto the sunflower market. Okay, so this is short term now. We're getting zooming in. Again, this was taken about 9 o'clock this morning. So in general, the canola market has seen a recovery over from about the 1st of December. We had some lows, some short-term lows put in December. We've seen a slight recovery that has been following the recovery in the soybean oil market fairly closely. I think there's still going to be some pressure in the canola market because of this very large soybean crop that's coming out of Brazil. So when we look at a global context, and I do have some slides on the global markets, just a little bit to give you some reference points. One of the things that canola is also kind of bumping up against is how much of a price premium can canola hold over, let's say, a soybean or a soybean oil product. So right now, a lot of trade dynamics going on. There's a lot of questions happening within trade, not only between the United States and Canada, but also Canada and Mexico, or US and Mexico, as well as US and China. So a lot of kind of international flavor going into the marketplace here, and I know causing some anxiety for a lot of farmers. So let me kick into like what's happening globally, and I just want to give you some perspective, because again, what happens in the global market does ripple into the US markets very, very quickly. So this is global vegetable oil production. So when we look globally at the tons, in this case, metric ton of production globally, palm oil is by far our largest production. So that is the dominant oil seed we see in the global marketplace. Soybean oil is second. Okay, now this is the oil production, not the raw commodity of soybeans, but actually soybean oil globally. Then we have rapeseed oil, which, you know, it's essentially canola oil. And then we have sunflower oil. So from a production standpoint, when we look at all the production available globally, sunflower production is a major oil seed in the global markets. Now, there's some caveats. The US market is slightly different than the global market for sunflower and sunflower oil. Now, this is vegetable oil exports. So I shifted gears. This is the exact same list, but it's just now looking at export volumes, not production volumes. So when we think about global trade and what are the global dynamics that might spill over into the US marketplace, palm oil is still by far the dominant product. And so whenever you hear something going on in the vegetable oil market, usually it has something to do with what's going on in palm oil. And I know as a farmer here in North Dakota or South Dakota, you're looking and saying, boy, what does palm oil have to do with the price of sunflowers? Well, those are the connections that I'm trying to make and trying to explain. Soybean oil from an oil trade, not the seed, but the actual crushed product is much lower, although significant. Rapeseed oil or canola oil as a crushed product is also significant, but look at the volumes of sunflower oil. So again, globally, sunflower oil is an important oil, very similar in trading volume to what we see in soybean oil, which surprises a lot of people. But again, the US market is very different from the global market. So we look at global exports, and again, I get questions about this in particular because of what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine and the war and the ability for both Russia and Ukraine to be able to not only produce, but also process and export their product. Now, these are the most recent numbers that we currently have. USDA does keep track of this. Notice that this is January numbers on the far right-hand side. So Ukraine is the largest producer and exporter of sunflower oil. Again, the crushed product, not the whole seed. Okay, Russia is number two. So anytime you hear anything about what's going on, challenges or potential kind of resolution of the war between Ukraine and Russia, that will have a big impact on global oil seeds, and it might have some spillover effect into what's happening here in the U.S. I do want to make one or two comments about Canada and the Canadian canola situation, because I do get questions about that. And again, earlier I showed that there was this strong connection between what happens in the canola market and how that impacts kind of the pricing system within the sunflower market. So I want to focus primarily on the column in the middle in blue. So this comes out of Statistics Canada. So that's the crop that's being crushed right now. That's the one that we just got done harvesting. It's now being exported and processed. The column on the far right-hand side in red is what Stat Canada is forecasting for next year. So even though we haven't planted any seed yet, they have come out with some initial forecasts. Now, I want to be cautious. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because those numbers are primarily mathematical forecasts. So they're looking at crop budgets, they're looking at rotation systems and saying, historically, what do we see as far as planted acreage and harvested acreage? They put in a trend line yield. And so based off of possible shifts in planted acreage, what might we see for production and consumption? So I don't want to put a lot of emphasis on the red column, because that can change pretty dramatically as we get into the season. The point I want to make on the canola side, look at what's going on in the green column, which is from 2 years ago, versus the blue column, which is the current year. The ending stocks in Canada have dropped significantly, so they're in a much tighter condition. So the question people ask is, well, given tighter inventories, why don't we see higher prices? And part of that is because of exports. Canada and Canadian canola is very, very dependent upon the export market. So the blue line is their domestic crushing. So they crush a lot of their own canola, and then they export the oil and the meal, or they use the oil and meal domestically. And then they export the whole seed, which is the red line. Now, notice the last couple of years, and in particular moving forward, there's this expectation that there's going to be a pretty significant drop off in the export pace. And that's one of the things I want to be cautious of, that even though the ending stocks, which is the blue bars now, that's that stocks to use ratio again, even though that's tightening up, it's becoming smaller. As we move forward in time, there's concerns about exports to China. So if we look at where does Canada ship their canola, what's the impact on canola pricing, and therefore what's the impact on sunflower pricing? This Chinese market is very, very important. And there has been some trade issues directly between China and Canada that have now caused some disputes. So even though the export pace so far this year has been relatively good, there's concerns about what will happen as we move forward in time. Okay, so there are some trade issues between Canada and China that are starting to bubble up, and now obviously some concerns about trade issues between the United States and Canada and what that might bring here in a few days.